Welcome. I'm Lisa Marginelli. I'm the editor-in-chief of Issues in Science and Technology, which is a quarterly journal that's a partnership between the National Academy of Sciences and Arizona State University. And I'm really happy to introduce today's discussion, How Can Philosophy Help NASA Explore the Cosmos? Before I introduce the speakers and the moderator, I just want to talk a little bit about the purpose for having these events. First, we really like to get really interesting, thoughtful people with expertise together to talk about important issues. And we also want to bring in to talk about the community, to talk about how science, technology, policy, and society interact. And so the first half of this meeting, this conversation today, will be the moderator talking with the panelists and having a conversation. And then the second half, we'll be taking your questions. So just a little bit of housekeeping. To enter your questions, you can use the Q&A function. It's down at the bottom of your screen. If you put them in the chat, we'll scrape them out of the chat and get them to the moderator anyway, but the simplest way is to put them in the Q&A function. So let's get started. Our moderator today is Marcia Smith. She is founder and editor of Space Policy Online. And for many years, she was with the Congressional Research Service and the National Academies doing space policy work. One of the first panelists is Ryan Faith. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Southampton, and he is a former House Space Subcommittee staffer and Vice News Defense editor. We also have Daniel Hastings, Interim Vice Chancellor and Cecil and Ida Green Education Professor of Aeronautics and Astronautics at the MIT. He's also President of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Tony Milligan is a research fellow in philosophy of ethics at King's College London. He's also author of Nobody Owns the Moon. And Erica Rogers is Director of Advanced Programs at the NASA Office of Technology, Policy, and Strategy. So I'm going to turn it over to Marcia to get this underway. Thank you very much. We look forward to this event.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and thanks to all the panelists who have agreed to embark on what I think is going to be a really interesting discussion. And I thought that we would start off with you, Ryan. You've written this very interesting paper on taking Aristotle to the moon and beyond. And what I took away from your paper was basically that you think that NASA has not done a sufficient job in explaining the why of space, why explore space. And that if they want to have an enduring program, they need to work more on that rather than looking just at individual milestones, as they did with Apollo, where they just landed on the moon and then there was nothing to follow it. So I guess I'm curious because I think NASA think, and Erica can talk about this, I think NASA thinks that they do a lot of work on explaining the why of exploration. So I'm wondering, is it the message or is it the messenger? Or is it that there are just a lot of people out there who are just never going to believe that there's value in exploration, whether it's space exploration or other types of exploration? In a sense, it's a belief system. You have to believe that it's important to really get to that first step where you want to listen to what someone's going to say. So why don't you just sort of share your thoughts on that?
Well, I would hesitate a little bit at the idea that they've done an insufficient or poor job. I think they've done more in the last 2 or 3 years than, certainly we've seen in years prior. But when we're talking about anything like leadership or strategy or vision or what have you, those all sort of boil down to questions of meaning and purpose and value. And for your strategy, whatever that is, to work, those have to be things that you can rigorously interrogate and process and chew on, sort of continuously. And I think one of the things that we can look at is that, the judicial system in the United States has been going on for more than 200 years, and that's still a work in progress, right? As we see through this, debates of the Supreme Court, military strategy is still a work in progress, and I think the philosophy of exploration is a work in progress. And many technical agencies don't have very good tools for engaging these kinds of questions of purpose. And so I think that's an area where NASA has gotten the conversation started, but it's something that needs to be And it's not now that the box is checked, we're done, but that it needs to be really deeply engaged and engaged more closely going forward.
So Erica, I know you've been doing a lot of work on this, and NASA had its own workshop on Artemis and ethics recently. And one thing I like to discuss is basically ethics and philosophy to me are really different things. Philosophy is more about, why do you do something, and ethics is how do you do something. But, how does NASA look at this whole issue?
Thanks for that question. We did take a look a year ago at our Moon to Mars objectives, and we thought about those different points of view that we may not be considering, inside of NASA. And so we held a workshop, and we got together lots of folks from the community outside of NASA with many different disciplines, and we discussed ethical and societal considerations surrounding our strategy for Moon to Mars activities and our plan for Artemis. And it was a really good way to sit and listen and be reflective and get a lot of feedback from the community, very specifically, very intentionally. And we asked the public's point of view on what they thought NASA should be.
Well, on my screen, at least, Erica has frozen for the moment.
Yes, mine too.
Okay. Well, we'll hold that thought, and when Erica comes back online, she can finish telling us about that. Daniel, what are your views on this?
I actually do think it would be valuable for NASA to have a consistent view, that it articulates for why it goes into space. Frankly, I think one of the things that has hurt NASA post Apollo is, that you heard shifting rationales for why we do things. So I remember the shifting rationales for why we needed a shuttle. And then for space station, I remember all the shifting rationales for that. It was for education, it was for exploration, it was for this, it was that. And at some point you say, well, do you really know what it's for, right? Or not, right? So my own take is that has hurt NASA. NASA needs to be consistent in what it says and what it does. Now the problem, of course, is that it's asking for a relatively large amount of money, and so it needs to be able to articulate a rationale that survives the scrutiny of people who say, well, we could use this money better somewhere else, right?
So Tony, how do you look at this? It's interesting to hear from someone outside the United States looking, because right now we're talking mostly about NASA. I'm not sure this is unique to NASA. I think it probably applies to space agencies everywhere, but how does it look from over there?
Yeah, I think a lot of people like the idea of space, but they're not quite sure about why they like the idea of space. And it is difficult to put together a single rationale that's going to work. And the rationales that tend to be offered focus upon things such as, well, does NASA pay its way? Are there enough cyclical feedbacks into the economy for it to make sense? And when we think about space as just major change for humanity, then those questions about the minutiae of tax and taxation seem to be rather small-minded given the scale of the undertaking. So I would say that the uncertainty about why we're doing all of this extends right across the West. It's certainly here in Europe and in the UK, as well as in the US. Now, I tend to think that shifting rationales are okay if your rationales start to shift, say, over 50 years or 100 years. But when the rationales shift, almost from year to year or political administration to political administration, that becomes a serious problem and contributes to the uncertainty that people have about the value of space exploration. And that becomes a particular problem, not just as a philosophical and conceptual issue, because few people go home at night and ask themselves the meaning of life and the meaning of space travel and so on. It becomes a political issue because there's an increasing coherence to the message being pushed out by those who are what I would call space skeptics. Now, space skepticism has bounced along in various different forms, but in recent years, it has become closely allied to attacks upon political elites. And that's a very cohesive message that one should regard the space sector as the plaything of these financial and political elites. But on the other hand, those who advocate for space don't seem to have a message that's anywhere near as cohesive as that to provide as a response. And that's a problem.
Well, do you think that it's different whether or not it's a government agency like NASA trying to explain why to do it versus Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos? I mean, is it different because one is, well, they're both often taxpayer money because, I mean, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos got a lot of government money, but I mean, it's primarily taxpayer dollars that go into NASA. And so is it a different kind of rationale that you need in these days when you have much more of the private sector involved? Is it a different message? How does all of that change the paradigm? Ryan, what do you think?
Well, I mean, so looping through very quickly what Daniel had mentioned is that what turns into shifting rationales a lot of times is when you have you're not basing things on a common underlying, there's nothing driving it, right? You can have a heuristic that generates different answers as long as you have a heuristic, because then that always provides you a consistency, even if that today you're going to talk about education, you're talking about something else. And I think with respect to Musk and Bezos is, I think that they enrich the conversation because at a very large level, sort of broadest of levels, right, we're trying to arbitrate or understand how we are going to interact with the rest of the universe. It's a large place, and it's going to take quite a bit of figuring out. So it's getting a lot of different ideas and testing them and engaging them and evaluating them and having, sort of very thoughtful ways of doing that. So I think that they can bring a lot to the table in terms of broadening discussions. But, like any other thing that's sort of high profile, and space is very high profile, is that it's, higher profile participants are going to attract higher profile criticism. There's not really much way around that.
So Erica, we seem to have you back. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Were you able to follow any of our conversation while you were gone?
No, sorry, I got a message that said rebooting due to a problem and I lost everything. Sorry about that.
Well, where we are now, we're sort of discussing whether or not trying to explain the philosophy of space or even the ethics of space is unique to space agencies, or with the emergence of the private sector, is it different? Now that you have, Tony had brought up the fact that some of the discussion is getting into sort of, is it fair to say, Tony, attacks against the elite, that the space exploration is getting all wrapped up in that. And I think people see the elites as being the Bezoses and the Musks and the other rich people who are sending people to Mars or, whatever they're going to be doing. So is this whole issue of the philosophy of space, the ethics of space, how does that change in an era when the private sector is becoming as much a part of the landscape as the government? What do you think, Erica? Did we lose you again? Well,
Yeah.
I guess I'll turn that question to Daniel until Erica returns to us.
Well, one thing you can say about Musk and Bezos is they do offer consistent rationales for what they're doing. So, Musk says he wants to send people to Mars, and everything is oriented towards making money to get people to Mars. Okay, at least that's consistent, right? And Bezos doesn't say he wants to send people to Mars. He says he wants to set up a society of thousands, tens of thousands of people living in space around the Earth. Okay, at least that's consistent, and it goes somewhere. And both of what they're doing, they're both SpaceX and Blue Origin are oriented towards those perspectives. I actually personally think that's a good thing. Whether or not it's realistic, I'm not sure is the issue, because what's happening is that for both of them, they are driving NASA and they're driving the Space Force, which I personally think is a good thing, right?
So Tony, do you think this elitism is part of the Musk-Bezos thing, or is it separate from that?
Well, I don't worry about Bezos and Musk and so on. I tend to think that a lot of people are trying to fight the battles of the 20th century and make them sort of turn out in a different way. And I'm not. This is just part of the world that we're in. That space, yes, it will make some of these people richer, but so will improved healthcare, so will almost any major positive social change that you make. It tends to have that kind of result. I do worry about the anti-space narrative. I mean, I'm not what you might call a natural enthusiast for space. I don't have the urge to go to space because I want to go to space or something of that sort. And I'm not a natural skeptic about this. I sit in between those two, and I think that the project is worthwhile because of the benefits that it offers to Earth and to humanity. And as a philosopher, that's what concerns me. You know, I don't wake up in the morning thinking about what Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are doing, whether it's benefiting them or harming them. I think about, is this good for the planet? Is it good for humanity? And having the kind of stable, in Daniel's terms, having a stable message about why this is good for the planet and for humanity, as it were, the goal that we're trying to pursue there, or the continuous series of actions, to pick up on something in Ryan's article, the actions that we consider to be virtuous and are just good to have going on. Those are the things that I tend to focus upon. But I think we do have to address that question about the narrative concerning elites and the way that it's weaponized against the space programs, and the way in which it seems to be converging with lines of political dissent. That's a troubling issue. It doesn't look big just now, but how is it going to look in 15 years' time and in 20 years' time? If those two fuse, it's going to become very difficult to separate out space skepticism from main lines of political dissent. And then you start getting funding problems and difficulties and distortions of programs.
Well, can I say something, Marcia?
Sure.
So, Tony, I think one of the issues in, let's call it the space enterprise, is that as you say, the anti-elite people think that space is really about humans in space. Of course, that's a very visible part of NASA. But the reality is, of course, is NASA does a lot of Earth science, which is good for us to understand our planet.
Yeah.
You know, the Space Force puts up GPS, without which none of us could survive today, you know, and there's communication satellites. There's an awful lot of space stuff which has nothing to do with humans in space.
Yeah.
And it's good for us. Right?
Yeah, it's really odd that message didn't get through. It's odd that the message that we understand global warming because of the data that we got from space, and also that we were able to recognize the runaway character of global warming because of research conducted into Venus and Mars, Venus especially. That message never got through. People think it's space or Earth, and you choose between them.
Right.
So Ryan, when you were writing your piece, were you looking at it both from the human spaceflight standpoint as well as robotic space flight and earth science and all of that?
Absolutely.
I focus on human spaceflight.
No, I absolutely think of them as both. As I don't necessarily know how useful it is to drive distinctions between them. They're part of a cohesive whole, and they have to kind of be thought of as a cohesive whole. Is that we don't send people, I mean, essentially you have a tool that somebody is using and it has a very long command and control loop, okay, because they're sitting, let's say, in Maryland, operating their tool, you know, millions of miles away, or you have somebody who's on site operating their tool. to engage, because all of our interactions in space are mediated, right? So I think that for a lot of things, as we're still figuring out when it makes sense to have one approach to using machines, to using our tools, and when it makes sense to have another, right? I mean, Parker Solar Probe absolutely cannot be a human mission. Okay, that's just, it's not going to work. GPS is not a human mission. It's not going to work. Same with Earth observation and so on and so forth. But at the same time, is that I'm wary of the idea that space is a place that will only be for robots. It's that there is a mix of some level, and I think it's going to take us, a long time in each of the domains we go to, whether it's the moon or Mars or low Earth orbit. It's going to take us a long time to really understand that balance and then how that works. I mean, you even look at the International Space Station, they've tried to introduce robotic assistants to help humans inside the ISS volume. So there's a lot going on, and it's to loop back to something very quickly, if I may, is that space, in my impression, tends to be a bit of a Rorschach test. So how people react to it is a lot more about what they're bringing to space, not what's sort of inherent in meaning in space. I mean, Mars doesn't have some sort of inherent deep narrative purpose for us because it's, this remote, distant rock. So if somebody comes to the table and that, to take Tony's example, are upset and agitated and energized about elites, it becomes very easy for them to go look at space and say, aha, this is an example of why I'm right. If somebody says, if they have a narrative that their human space program is going to represent the emergence of their country into the world and demonstrate their global prowess as a true superpower, well, then that's what they're going to go see in space. And that ability to sort of read into space or to project a little bit, I think, is one of the things that makes it difficult, which is ultimately the reason that I'm kind of a big fan of going back and trying to really very carefully interrogate and rigorously think about what we're doing and why.
So I'm reminded back in July of 1989, when George H.W. Bush started the Space Exploration Initiative, and he stood on the steps of the National Air and Space Museum. I think he was the one who said it. I should have looked this up before this webinar, but I think he's the one who said, it is humanity's destiny to strive to seek to find, and it is America's destiny to lead. Yeah, is that enough of a rationale, or does that just fall flat and just sound like empty words?
I mean, there's one of the problems that we run into, and I think this happens a lot, and this is something I've seen in different arenas, is that people will talk about space with the tools available. Okay, so if you are in a society that has a certain set of values, that's going to be the playbook from which you read. Okay, if you have an American president standing in front of the Air and Space Museum, yep, that's going to be the script that he goes to, just because it's sort of the closest tool at hand rhetorically. And this is one of the things that makes discussion of values and purpose and meaning really, really vital, because we can't sort of look at the political speech and say, well, now we've established all of this, right? There's a lot of work that goes into it. I mean, if you took a look at NASA's most recent strategy work, right, and they're starting to say, okay, here's 3 reasons we go to space. This is how we're thinking about it. We need unity of purpose and constancy of purpose. And there's now sort of this sense of rigor developing along these discussions. And I think that's something that is now, the start, not the end. But otherwise, we're just basically, what did the speechwriter come up with? What did Kennedy's mind when he was looking for analogies? Oh, okay, we're going to talk about new oceans. Okay, there we go. And you're going to keep marching that all the way over there. And it's partly because the activity of space exploration has such profile and such incredible impact, and it sort of conspicuous at a visceral level. It's really easy to access imagery, but it's very easy to confuse imagery with reason or purpose.
So Erica, we hope we have you back permanently now. You're on mute though. So, when we last saw you, you were talking about the recent study that you look at with Artemis and ethics.
Yeah.
Looking at that and more broadly, how does NASA view this these days? I mean, the George H.W. speech was a long time ago. How does NASA look at it now?
Well, we want to think about responsible exploration because it's about humanity. And there is NASA work, there is NASA leadership, but there is an approach here that's more than NASA. You know, as mentioned, sorry, I missed some of the dialogue, but you know, the discussion that there is the sector.
I'm afraid we're losing you again.
And so
I'm afraid we've lost you again, Erica.
apologies. I will try to dial in by phone.
Oh, that's a good idea. All right. So anyway, so getting back to this whole philosophy and looking at ethics, and Tony, maybe I'll start with you on this. What is the difference between philosophy and ethics? Am I right that philosophy is why you go and ethics is how do you go and how do you not ruin the solar system for everybody else?
You know, you ask people at different points in history what philosophy is, then they're going to give you different stories. A century ago, people would have spoken about morality more than they would have about ethics, but then you look at the Google, you do the data search on it, and out of the 500 billion books on the Google database, it turns out that ethics has become this really big way of speaking about things. I think that ethics can include questions about meaning as well. So I'm happy to say that it's an ethical question to say how meaningful will it be for us to go into space? What will it mean for humanity to no longer be, as it were, operating within Earth as essentially an enclosed system? What will it mean when we're operating over cislunar space between Earth and Moon? How will that change the way in which we understand our own being, to speak philosophically about it? So I see ethics as an aspect of philosophy, and the uninteresting ethics turns out to be how do you just arrive at some decision procedure? How do you follow a code? How do you follow a set of rules? Because that doesn't tell you very much about what humans are and what they would like to be and how they feel about the world. I think the interesting ethics is the deep ethics that asks questions of the sort that Ryan asks in the paper about what are we trying to do and where are we trying to go and what's the meaning of our activity, and how do we arrive at a plausible story about what this means for humans? I think those are the deep kinds of questions that Ryan's opened up.
So Daniel, I think I saw you nodding your head there.
Well, I was wondering if ethics would just be applied by how we treat each other, but it sounds like Tony, you're arguing that we will have a different perspective on our humanity by going out to space and looking at it from far away, right? Is that sense you're giving me?
Yes, absolutely. If you think about the Earth just now, essentially it's a sort of enclosed system. We don't really bring much back, and we can't push anything away. And we need to be able to do both of those things. The history of Earth as an enclosed industrial system with a large number of people on it is not. It's great in terms of general improvements in human well-being, but there are a lot of things that we're scoring badly on, and environmental care is one of them. So how long can we continue as a closed system rather than something that's more open, where there's movement, where we can push the stuff that we don't want out of the system and bring in the stuff that we really do want. And when you do that, and then you start to think of yourself as belonging, as it were, to a larger area.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So Ryan, you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. There's, throughout all of history, basically, human history until rather recently, the human world, such as it is, was, maybe a couple 100 feet above the ground, tops, how far you could shoot an arrow into the sky, roughly. And then everything else beyond that was sort of wallpaper, it's background, it's scenery. And maybe it affects you in some sort of weird astrological way, or you see the seasons moving, but it's not a place that has any physical, that you can't engage physically, right? And then all of a sudden we've changed it. Now the rest of the universe is a place that we can go, or we can contemplate going, or we can do things, and we have some sort of physical activity. And it's, to sort of loop two thoughts together, is that you're going, essentially from a closed system to an open system, or at least a larger closed system that's the side of the solar system. Going in, anytime you go from closed to open or back and forth, that's a dramatic change in what you do. And as thinking a little bit about what I'm trying to say by philosophy, and I think maybe another way to get at it is how space exploration engages investor relations, how we engage our investors in society and explain to them what our strategy is and what we're doing and why this is a solid, course of action. Or another way is thinking about it is really getting a more solid understanding of customer requirements, rather than just sort of saying, okay, the customer's given me a list of 3 things they want, but like, what 3 things, and why is it these 3 things? And is this the best way to do those 3 things? And helping them sort of think through the problem that they're trying to solve. Because, at a very deep level, is space exploration isn't solving a problem. It may be solving a problem, but we don't know what the problem is yet. So we have to do a lot of thinking about this. It's like we expect that engaging, Earth observation will teach us more about the environment. But we can't say with great certainty, like, well, okay, in 23 years, it's going to mean these 7 things. Now I have this very, very strict notion of what to do. So it's very open-ended. And when you're getting into open-ended, questions about how you place humanity in the universe, that's like legitimately tricky stuff. And isn't, it's not a 1 seminar, 1 book kind of deal. It's an ongoing discussion.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah,
I think there
I'd
are
like
some
to add in
people who
here.
think that humanity is not ready yet to move out into the solar system, that we have some evolving to do on our own. What do you think about that, Tony?
I think that the answer to that is in terms of the political structures that we have. So you don't want to go out into that big wider area of space and create, as it were, iron skies. You don't want to have horrible political systems. So there are points in time within human history where it would have been a really bad idea for us to move into space. But we have these democratic systems across much of the West. We're not sure about how stable they are in the long term. There's a lot of pressures. There's no guarantees that the best political systems, best flawed political systems that we've developed will last indefinitely. We're not sure about how long that window will be open. So I think that at the moment our political systems are good enough for us to go. And I suspect very much, and not just have a suspicion, but in terms of the evidence here, I think that we're not doing a great job within that closed system. When people think fix the problems on Earth and then go out into space, I think that without space, the problems get worse. We were very, very lucky in terms of getting into space when we did. Imagine the problems of climate change without satellite systems. Imagine if that Venus research hadn't been done in the 60s, so that 20 years later, we could recognise its significance. We got extremely lucky getting as far into space as we did at that point in time. Without that, our human predicament would be so much worse. So I don't see it as either or 2 stages: fix Earth, then go into space. I think that if we don't go into space, we probably don't fix Earth.
Well, focusing really on human exploration, what do you think, Daniel? Is humanity ready to move out into the solar system?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not personally, convinced of that. Yeah, at least in part because of the expense associated with humans going out into the solar system, right? I mean, we're talking about significant amounts of resources that one has to spend if one does it in the large, as opposed to just sending up a few people to a space station or something like that. But actually, Tony's made me think that, this change of perspective we would get by sending enough people into space might actually be very valuable for us for some of the reasons he actually said, because, it gives us both new data, but also new ways of thinking, both about space and about the problems on Earth. So in that sense, I think that's a good thing.
Ryan?
Can I add on? Could you?
Oh,
can you hear
Eric,
me,
are you
Michelle?
there?
Yes,
Hi.
back.
Yes, I'm
Oh,
on the
yes, by
phone.
all means.
I am sorry. It is a rough computer afternoon. Apologies. I just wanted to add on to that. I think there's time here to learn about all of these things, because our plans are for returning humans to the surface of the moon, back to human exploration, developing our capabilities, expanding our capabilities over time, and then moving into much more of a sustained lunar presence. And this isn't going to happen tomorrow, which is, it's going to happen over time, but having a conversation about it right now is very valuable to prepare ourselves and to prepare the community for this work that we do. But it's a time frame in which we can learn to continue to incorporate into our policies and practices. How do we make sure that we are doing the work for the benefit of all, and understanding who is benefiting from the activities that we do?
Ryan?
Yeah, I think that in terms of what humanity is ready for, is I think that humanity would be ready to go to the moon in the next 5 years or so. I think humanity might be ready for its first missions to Mars, maybe about 2050. It's that this sort of going out into the solar system notion, right, is that we run the risk. There's a risk of being sort of dragged into these very sort of science fictional scenarios of things that are going to take 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 years to unfold, right? So as Eric is saying, is that's a feature, that's not a bug, because we've got to do a lot of thinking and understanding. It's like nobody, when we were looking at Apollo, some of the most dramatic and the high points of public opinion and the most dramatic impacts came from things like Earthrise and the Blue Marble photos, right? That wasn't what we went out there for, right? And so as we go, we discover things and we engage. I think that it would be, the prospect of how humans are going to be as they go out into the solar system and build space stations around Callisto or something like that is far enough out that if we just simply keep to what we have any chance of doing, that's sort of a naturally self-limiting factor. I mean, maybe I'll wake up tomorrow and we'll have space stations around Callisto, but it's not anything that's on my planning horizon.
Well, I'd like to move now to questions from the audience. And this is not directed at anyone in particular. Maybe I'll point this at Daniel. The panel seem to generally agree that a somewhat or heavily privatized future of space exploration and development is inevitable and perhaps even desirable. If space science and technology are to be developed with the public good in mind, how do we reconcile that with the private for-profit sector operating with a fundamentally different ethical framework?
Oh, well, I think the reality is apart from an economic benefit, the private sector will not do it, right? I mean, why would they? Unless there's some economic benefit actually associated with it. One might be able to construct, such a thing. But I actually do think this is an important role, a continued role for a government which has the long-term view and not necessarily driven by a commercial return. So I think the answer to the question is it cannot just be the private sector. It has to be people who care about all these other things, associated with being in space, right?
So to add on to Daniel's comment is that, if you look at space is difficult, therefore it's expensive. So how are we deriving value? What's making this what's worth the haul, right? And we've fairly early on in the 60s established that there's a political prestige value to be had. There's a scientific value to be had. And we're still sort of interrogating doing stuff in space to figure out how and why it can be made worth the haul. I don't know what the killer app for space, if there's ever going to even be one, let alone what it's going to be. I think what we're seeing in recent years is not this notion that the private sector is going to be, you know, heading off and building, you know, Starbucks on Mars or something. But I think we're kind of having a discussion right now, a public discussion about ways that we can derive value from space. And where it becomes really interesting, at least in my mind, is that we talk about, you know, sustainability and responsible use of space. And I think there's an important need to think about it not as a competition between space or commerce or politics or exploration, but this idea that you're trying to avoid foreclosing future value. So what can we do that is valuable now that will not cut somebody else off downstream, because we're not sure that this short-term activity is going to be all that useful, we hope, but we don't know. So how do we preserve the options later on? And, you know, because we're trying to basically, in aggregate, through all of these avenues, maximize value under the curve.
Yes.
Tony, did you want to add
I'll
something?
add that.
Go ahead, Erica. I can't see you on the screen, Erica, so I don't know when you want to
I
say
know.
something. So please go ahead.
So, thank you so much, Marcia. Apologies for that. I think there is a role for government to continue. This is where good governance and policy can come into play, and some regulatory practices that will probably transpire in the years to come as we move people and instruments and robotics further out into the solar system and in more numerous ways. I think that the government does have a role as well to continue to model good behavior that we would like to be instilled as participants start to come up into our now very large global space community. You know, this is not just US, this is an international community of space actors and space activities. And so, you know, there's a lot of work to be done internationally as well that helps keep the community together at large to practice responsible uses of space and to coordinate on space activities so that the global community can seek that benefit that we desire. Back over to you, Marcia. Thank you.
Okay, Tony, did you want to add something?
Just that the normal pattern of human activity for as long as we have had any kind of recorded history has been a combination of activities by states and by private agents and collections of private agents. That's the normal pattern of human history. We got very messed up in the 20th century when we began to imagine that these were somehow things that you could disentangle and still have good functional societies. So people want to run those arguments on, and they want to think that somehow Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are pulling all the strings, that they're dominating what happens. But a lot of what they're doing is in fact tied up with the state sector. A lot of it's resupply missions to International Space Station, so on. So it's that entanglement that is very important. Getting that right, getting the way in which we get private agents in the private sector to do the things that really work, that they're good at, and getting states to do the things that they're really good at, and getting them to not, you know, throw things at each other, but to operate and play nicely around the table. That's part of the business of getting space expansion right. But of course, they're not the only people around the table. There's multiple interest groups. There's multiple stakeholders. There's scientists. There's people who have specific cultural attitudes towards specific objects in space. This is a big table in a big room with a lot of people who are around it, and to imagine that you can take either government out of the room or the private sector out of the room and still have a functioning room is just, I think, a bit. It's very 20th century. There are big problems, big difficulties in space, but those are primarily about getting the players to play in the right way with each other, and addressing questions such as the finite resources that are going to be accessible at any given point in time. Those are 21st century problems. The state versus private, to me, looks very old.
Well, there's an interesting question here that I think is for Erica, but I'm going to ask Tony a follow-on question. So the question, Erica, is what would it really look like for NASA to consult with or hire philosophers? Are there existing models
Oh.
for or examples of this kind of engagement that have led to a more robust strategy or direction? And I guess I would ask Tony, do you think philosophers would want to go to work for NASA or any space agency? I mean, is space enough of a philosophical question that they would feel fulfilled doing that? But Erica, let's start with you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I will say that as time goes on and we consider the disciplines that we have inside of our agency, that we get more and more disciplines added over time, because you need that multidisciplinary point of view to really be impactful if you are trying to have a benefit back to humanity and back to the public, and really make that forefront and intentional. So I would say that it's constant evolving inside of NASA, and I think other agencies as well, these considerations that we need to have from the multiple points of view. So we seek input a lot, even if we don't have that one particular discipline inside of our agency. Other agencies do. That might be their very specific domain. And so we work by getting feedback from other agencies that have specific domain expertise, as well as seeking input from the public and non-governmental organizations who can give that insight to us, and then we can have a dialogue so that we understand those different points of view when we're thinking about crafting input to help our decision making. Tony, over to you.
And Tony, is there a community of philosophers who think about space?
Yes, we're not massive, but compared to 10 years ago, we're a burgeoning and growing and thriving community. 10 years ago, you really could. Well, there was when I started writing Nobody Owns the Moon, there were three. That seemed to be it. And Jacques Arnaud and there was Eric Persson in Europe, and myself and Jamie Schwartz came along a bit later. But we've certainly grown a lot from that. And the difficult thing, of course, is to get philosophers who appreciate that there was a discourse about space ethics that emerged from within the space community and within NASA, and these questions have been asked for a long time. So it's inserting ourselves into that and doing so in an intelligent way, and asking the kinds of questions that Ryan asks in his article, and doing the work to make sure that you know the detail, and that you're not regarding everything as a nail that your particular philosophical hammer can bang in. That's the thing that we have to address on our side as philosophers. But yes, this is it's great to have that engagement. There are things that we can offer. Even thinking about the Artemis and ethics event back in September. I saw the report from that. I wasn't at the event. I saw the report, and one of the really interesting things to me there was that they did a tick box kind of exercise. What are you interested in most? And most of the people there said governance, and there's a big list of other things that they said. And then you come down quite reasonably low, and it's how do we spread the goods across society, the goods that are associated with space. And that looked really low to me. And I thought, how do you get that to work? How do you think about everyone's interested in governance, but nobody's really interested in spreading the goods of space or even understanding what they are? So I thought, that's the kind of things that a philosopher homes in on straight away and sees that, no, these two have to be level. We have to also be interested in addressing that question of what are the goods of space? What are we aiming towards? What are the ends? What are the right kinds of activities? Anyway, yes, that's.
So there's what are the goods that come from space, and then what are the resources that go into space? And so we have a question here about resources. So I think I'll pose this to Ryan, wearing his previous hat, being on a congressional committee, and Daniel as the head of or vice chancellor of a major university where resource allocation is always a big issue. And I'll read the question. It says, one issue is who should get to decide how to spend the resources allocated various space exploration initiatives. Inevitably, there are many more projects and directions for inquiry than the resources available. So it seems that figuring out the best mechanism for allocating resources is important in an era where people may be skeptical about turning over such decisions solely to billionaire entrepreneurs or government leaders, NASA. Do the panelists see room for rethinking how such resource allocation decisions are made? Ryan?
Well, just sort of a point of clarification, and again, this gets to sort of, public narrative, is that the amount that NASA, I would guess, and don't quote me on this, but I guess that NASA is probably putting about 10 times as much money into space as our space entrepreneurs, roughly something on that order of magnitude. So, they're not running the entire game. NASA is still very large and has controlling share. But when we get to this question of how do we fit these things together, and I was just looking at the recurring tenets in NASA's Moon to Mars strategy, and you have things like interoperability and sustainability, right? So it's important to not damage what we're doing in future. And if we can sort of aspire to a higher level of that's just that we start to get things that are sort of reinforcing and that they're mutually supportive. We can't do all of the things, and we probably shouldn't do all of the things because many of the things are probably pretty daft. But can we at least evaluate on a technical level what seems to work and then what seems to be most supportive of the broad effort? I would be more inclined to support an architecture that engages international partners and engages the private sector because it's building out a broader base of support and it's sort of providing a broader utility. And then I'd be looking at things like durability. How long can we do this? Is this something that creates options going forward, or does this close and constrain options going forward? In terms of the sort of the basic question of who is to decide, is that it first starts with a person with a checkbook, and then they ultimately decide, and then it's a question of who they wish to listen to. And if you pull on that thread, you can look at what NASA is doing, for instance, with the Artemis report, and other organizations do about trying to add voices to the mix. But there's not I don't think there's really a place for a space czar to sort of sit there and arbitrate that this is the mission, that's not the mission. It's we've got jigsaw puzzle pieces that don't quite fit. How do we shape them and mold them and squish them and sand them to where we can build something coherent out of it?
Daniel?
Well, I would say that this is where Ryan's argument about philosophy is actually really important. If you think about it, if you look at the Space Force, which has a clear mission, which is to deter aggression in space, and then if there is aggression, to win, then that drives you to what are the resources necessary to do that, given the appropriate threats. And I would say, in the same way, on the Earth science part of NASA, if the mission is that we need to have enough understanding from space so as we can understand what's going on with our planet, that actually then drives the level of resources that you need to actually do that. It's the human exploration part of NASA. So why are we doing that? And if the answer is we're doing it because we want to have humanity move out towards Mars and the Moon and Mars, then that helps set the level of resources necessary to do that. So in that sense, I completely buy the argument. Start with the rationale, and then that will tell you the resources you actually need.
Well, we are unfortunately coming to the end of our appointed time. And so I guess I would just like to ask everyone, I'll start with you, Erica, sort of what are the next steps? We had this fascinating discussion, and there are lots of really good ideas have come out of it, but what is the next step to sort of get a handle on the philosophy and ethics of space? Erica, are you still with us?
I am here. Thank you. The next step is to continue to have dialogue for us at the agency. We have dialogue inside the agency. Like I mentioned, we get input from outside the agency, and we're also talking a lot with our international partners and with our Artemis Accord signatory community as well, is to help understand the different points of view that all the countries have as we work to explore together and set those principles that we would like. So the next step for us is to continue to take feedback from everyone into our decision-making practices and then share that information back out with the community.
Tony, what's next?
I think the next step is probably something to do with Space Force, and that's how you address the question of the risk of deliberately created debris fields that can disrupt the operation of satellites, with devastating impact upon human welfare on the ground. So I'm going to give a Space Force answer to that. That's if we end up with these deliberately created debris fields for strategic reasons, then our larger ambitions are moving beyond low Earth orbit and near Earth orbit. They become moot. So
Daniel?
Well, I'm going to give a large scale answer. I was very intrigued by Tony's comments. So I think the next step is actually to develop the thinking which could occur NASA in concert with international partners about what does it actually mean for us to be in space, and how, that is, humans in space, and how does that change our perspective on what goes on the Earth, and as well as obviously the humans in space. How's our vision of humanity different as a result of this?
Ryan, you get the last word.
Thank you. The thing that sort of been occupying my attention in the last couple of weeks is starting to think about is really more sort of DC government mechanics. What are the fora for discussion? How do you get, who are the stakeholders? Who do you need to get in? What is this binding? Is this non-binding? Is arbitration? Where does it live? Because I think the problem that NASA faces, has done the big important first step of getting this giant ball rolling, and this has been by no means easy, is that NASA is not sort of by charter or by nature a deliberative body like the Supreme Court. Okay, it can do what it can within its scope. So then the question is does anything need to live outside of NASA? Does it lead into inside of NASA? Is it international? Is it going to be private? Is it commercial? And how are there ways what are ways that we can have debates that are productive and generate useful outcomes, so they don't just devolve into yelling matches or, lists of priors, but, are they that they can generate insights that are useful, provide useful inputs to anybody in the space community, really.
Well, I will tell you, there are some really excellent questions still left here. I wish we had another hour or so to keep going, because it's obviously a fascinating topic, and there are a lot of people who want to chime in. So maybe Lisa will have another one of these sessions in a few more months. But thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to all the people asking the questions. And Lisa, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marcia, Ryan, Daniel, Erica, and Tony. This was a very interesting conversation. It made me wish that we had something like a cabinet level philosopher, that we could discuss more philosophy in regards to all of our S&T challenges. It offers a very interesting a way of kind of pulling away from some of the operational questions that we tend to engage with and actually think about their kind of larger implications. I mean, one of the things that came up here, sorry, I've written on scraps of paper, and I know that you were all very engaged. We had an unprecedented number of questions, and we got to a tiny fraction of them, something like 8% of the questions. But this whole question of how do we preserve later options, and that reaches even into the space debris question, but also reaches into how we talk about sort of everyday things and very grand things, and who do we become through the technology that we design. This is all kind of amazing stuff, and I just want to thank you all for being here. And say that if you like this kind of conversation, you come to the right place. You can read more of our work at Issues in Science and Technology, which is issues.org. You can sign up for our newsletters to hear about other discussions. We also have a podcast where we continue these sorts of discussions. And we have an episode with Zach Pirtle, who does some philosophy at NASA. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again to this panel. And thank you, Marcia, for leading this discussion. We'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.